Support for WUWM podcasts comes from Johnson Financial Group, helping customers build financial plans around their unique goals for over 55 years. More at johnsonfinancialgroup.com. Johnson Bank and Johnson Wealth Inc. are Johnson Financial Group companies.
You're listening to Lake Effect Spotlight from WUWM, Milwaukee's NPR station. Here's one of our favorite conversations about what's happening in the city.
Last month, the Seventh Circuit Court of Appeals issued a decision on the ongoing battle over the Line 5 pipeline in northern Wisconsin. The Bad River Band of Lake Superior, Chippewa has been fighting to get a portion of the pipeline off tribal lands for over a decade. The court confirmed that Enbridge, which operates the pipeline, has been trespassing on those lands. Enbridge is in the process of rerouting the line outside of tribal lands, but the court wasn't clear about the next steps for removal. Stefanie Tsosie is a senior attorney with EarthJustice and represents the Bad River Band of Lake Superior, Chippewa. She talks with WUWM environmental reporter Susan Bence about the latest on Line 5.
At the end of July, the Seventh Circuit ruled on a case that it's been sitting on for 2.5 years. And that case is an action by the Bad River Band to remove the part of Line 5 that Enbridge has that goes through the reservation. So there's about 12 miles that goes through the reservation through land that's owned either by the band or band members. And several of those parcels need tribal consent before an easement can be renewed. But all of those expired in 2013. And since that time, Enbridge has been trespassing. So they've been operating on the reservation without a valid easement. And at the end of July, the Seventh Circuit affirmed that, yes, Enbridge is trespassing on that land. And they do need to stop. But the Seventh Circuit kind of stopped short of saying when or how or who's going to enforce that remedy. But, they do need to stop. The Seventh Circuit also found the amount of money that was awarded to the band for trespassing wasn't quite right. And so they remanded to the judge to figure out the restitution for trespassing on that land. And then another part is having to do with federal law and state public nuisance law. It gets a little legalese there. But the court did find that public nuisance is kind of displaced by this other federal law. So that gets a little complicated. And again, that goes back to the federal district court in in Wisconsin.
Yeah. So bottom line, Stefanie, what's the significance of this decision?
That victory with the Seventh Circuit, that recognition that Enbridge has been illegally operating on reservation land since 2013 is a great affirmation. It's of the band's rights. Unfortunately, we're all still in disagreement about what happens with that pipeline. So the Seventh Circuit said it's got to stop at some time. But I think that what it really does show is that we need a way to get Enbridge out. We need a way to stop oil flowing. And I'm really hoping that in the lower court that, once this goes back, that they see that there has to be a remedy for trespass, right? There has to something has to happen if somebody is on your land illegally since 2013. And I'm really hoping the lower court sees that. And I'd like to clarify that EarthJustice is not representing the band in this lawsuit in trespass, but I think this is something that we would like to see is companies being held accountable for trespassing on tribal lands.
So then just to clarify, this July 30th U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals decision then triggers the matter going back to a lower court?
Correct.
Okay.
Yes, the matter goes back to Judge Conley in the federal district court in Wisconsin to fashion some remedies consistent with that decision.
Okay. So in the meantime, construction of this reroute, which you just touched on, intended to move Line 5 outside of tribal land, that's been in motion since February, right? They started working on that reroute. But on June 27th, there was a spill. So yeah. I believe that triggered a pause in construction.
Yeah. And just to clarify really quickly, the construction was only paused at 4 waterway crossings.
Right.
So Enbridge is still constructing in other parts of the reroute. So it's only these 4 waterway crossings. And that, we asked in state court for the judge to stay construction on those 4 waterway crossings because Enbridge doesn't meet the legal requirements. They don't actually own the land that's there at the time that construction was halted. At the end of June, they got permission from DNR to construct in those 4 permits, or the types of permissions that Enbridge thinks it's needed. We still think that that's not sufficient. It still doesn't meet the Wisconsin law about land ownership requirements for that. But after Enbridge got those permissions, they went back to the court and asked the Judge Anderson in state court to lift the stay, meaning that they can start construction. And that's what we opposed in July. And there will be a hearing on that, lifting the stay on those 4 waterway crossings on August 13th. Part of our challenge is that Wisconsin law says that if you're going to do this very specific type of construction, you need to be a riparian owner, which means you need to own the land. And Enbridge doesn't, frankly, own the land in some of these crossings where it's required. And so at some point, Enbridge went back, applied to DNR, asking for exemptions under this statute because they met certain exemption criteria.
So there's a series of permits that are required in this kind of a project, right? One or a series comes from the U.S. Army Corps, and it approved the reroute, I think, back in October of 2025. The Bad River is challenging that decision.
Yes. In October of 2025, the Army Corps published the final decision document, which had all of its environmental analyses in that document. And they issued a preliminary permit that wasn't signed. It wasn't until February of this year that the Army Corps issued the final signed permit. And the Bad River Band, is challenging that decision in federal court. We're in the District of DC in front of Judge McFadden. So we're in the process of responding to that, and we'll return those briefs in September. I think September 14th is our next deadline. So that's a back and forth briefing schedule that's going right now.
What's the significance of this case in your mind? Why is it important?
I think this case in particular, a lot will have a ripple effect within Indian country, or it can, especially because Enbridge is blatantly trespassing, willingly, knowingly, all of the words through Bad River Band's reservation. And they have been for over a decade. And, what we need and what we've been fighting for is a recognition of that. And also that the reroute isn't a solution to that. So Enbridge's solution, the false solution to reroute that part of the pipeline around the reservation, doesn't solve the band's concerns. The band sits between the reroute and Lake Superior. The reroute is entirely upstream of the band's reservation. And so things that go in the water flow downstream through the band's reservation and into Lake Superior, into the Bad River sloughs, which, are the heart of the wild rice beds in that region. And I don't know if you've been out there or if any of your listeners have been out there, but the place it's magical. The sloughs are magical, and the wetlands in that region, we were very fortunate to have staff from Bad River Band's Natural Resource Department lead us, and by us I mean attorneys from EarthJustice as well as attorneys from the environmental groups, lead us in that area. And there are parts of those wetlands that are just pristine, that look how wetlands should look, how they used to look in northern Wisconsin before there was a ton of development. And so I think it is really a case about homeland. It's a case about protecting water resources, about protecting Lake Superior for everybody, not just the band, but also everybody who lives in that region. And these resources that have been there for quite some time, that you might not notice or you might not see, but if you're out there, you definitely know when you're walking around in a special place.
Anything you want to add?
I think, it's important to remember there's a lot of moving parts here. So when we're talking about Line 5 is a very long pipeline. It goes through Wisconsin, it goes through Michigan, and there's a lot of opposition, not just in the Bad River Band's area, right? So I focus on this because this is where my work is. But the Bay Mills Indian community up in Michigan has been fighting against Line 5 as well. And they had a great victory in their state Supreme Court, where their state Supreme Court basically revoked one of the authorizations that Enbridge needs for failure to comply with the state's environmental laws. And so the opposition is not just localized to Line 5, it's all along Line 5. And like I said, there's a lot of moving parts. We have a state case in Wisconsin. There's the federal case that we filed in DC. There's the case about the trespass, which is in the Western District of Wisconsin. So there's a lot going on. It's very easy to get that mixed up. So keeping those straight can be a little difficult, which I recognize because there's just a lot going on. So that's the first thing that I would say. I also think that the Seventh Circuit decision is a great reminder that tribal land is sovereign, that tribal land has the ability to kick out companies, people, whomever that they don't want on their land. But what we need to see is a vindication of that right. What we need to see is something happening there. And there was a part of the Seventh Circuit ruling. They talk about how much of quote unquote good Line 5 is with the energy that it provides. I just want to remind everyone that a lot of the product that goes through Line 5 ends up back in Canada. Enbridge is a Canadian company, pumps oil and gas mostly from Canada and then back into Canada. And so the benefit to the US is not as clear, I think, as it might seem. And the Seventh Circuit also did not rubber stamp the reroute either. It acknowledged that the reroute is in process, that there's legal challenges, but regardless of what the Seventh Circuit says, Enbridge still has to comply with state law. We saw in Michigan that it didn't comply with Michigan state law and they kicked back that permit. Wisconsin has the opportunity to do that here. There are some robust wetland laws and waterway laws in Wisconsin to protect those resources. And, the heart of our challenge is that Enbridge didn't comply with those laws. So regardless of what the Seventh Circuit says, you still got to follow the law.
Stefanie Tsosie is a senior attorney with EarthJustice, and she represents the Bad River Band of Lake Superior, Chippewa. She spoke with WUWM environmental reporter Susan Bence. Enbridge Energy Partners is a financial supporter of WUWM.
That was the Lake Effect Spotlight podcast. It comes from your local NPR station, WUWM. Subscribe to the Lake Effect Spotlight podcast to hear more great stories about Milwaukee.